I'm Duncan Lievi, and this video is going to be dedicated to Djokovic's 2021 Australian Open victory and the role that COVID played in the whole scheme of things, not just with relation to Djokovic. Players were required to quarantine for 2 weeks preceding the Australian Open, and families, if the players brought their families, they would not be allowed to leave the room for the entirety of those 2 weeks. The only exception made was for the players who were told they could practice for a certain amount of hours during the day. Apparently this has resulted in, or factored into, some of the injuries that were suffered by a lot of the top players in the draw, including Dimitrov and Djokovic himself. Nadal began with a back injury, Berrettini withdrew, so all of these, and Thiem himself was not feeling his best, apparently. So it remains to be seen whether there's a direct link in the enforcement of a massively strict quarantine and players getting injured during the tournament after. We're not entirely sure, but we know that Zverev and Djokovic are not very enthusiastic about this level of strictness being enforced. We shall see how that proceeds. Now, on to Djokovic himself. The thing I want to address is the impact of his victory and how impressive it is, actually. So as we all know, during the third round, Djokovic suffered a abdominal tear, which was confirmed today during the press conference, but in the third round, Djokovic suffered an abdominal tear, which resulted in him losing focus for about 2 sets, and then miraculously coming back to win the match, a testament to his tenacity, if nothing else. And we all know he's a fighting champion, and his primal roar at the end of that match is a testament to that as well, and evidence to that, I should say. From then, his performances were in question. We were not sure whether he would participate in a match again in the tournament, something that he confirmed himself right after that match itself. He waited for results of tests, and 2 hours before his match with Milos Raonic, he got the go-ahead from the doctors, and then he decided to play the match, assessing that the pain that he was suffering from was at a manageable level. He fought through that match. He lost 1 set, I believe, in that match, but he managed to win, and it was satisfactory. Following that was the big question. He was playing one of the most prominent members of the next gen in Zverev, and I was not sure whether he'd be able to ward off Zverev, even though when it comes to high-pressure situations, Zverev does not win a lot. His mental toughness is still developing, from what it seems, and experience shone through when Djokovic won that match in straight sets, and that is when his ascent began again in the level of his play. And after his semi-final match against first-time debutant Grand Slam semi-finalist Karatsev, when Djokovic played that match, it was evident that he was back. His movement was back, his shot depth was back, his classic celebrations were back. He was Djokovic. He was doing all that he usually does, and that is the reason why I was very confident about his chances going into the final against Medvedev. I saw a poll before the match asking, who do you think is going to win the final? And was rather surprised to see 52 or 3% of people choosing Medvedev. Now, Medvedev is a very talented player, and he was on a tear leading up to the Australian Open, and even during the Australian Open, especially when he disposed of Rublev and then Tsitsipas in the semi-final. Tsitsipas looked a bit drained from his match with Rafael Nadal. He was not able to produce the same level of play during the semi-final, but notwithstanding, Medvedev was playing at a very high level. And I knew that it was potentially going to be a closely fought match, but I never believed that this was the time that Medvedev would shine through and break through and win his first Grand Slam title. In fact, all the exploits of the next gen have occurred at non-Grand Slam tournaments, so the ATP World Tour Finals, those come to mind. All these best-of-3 settings in which they have beaten the big three. So the actual coronation of the next gen is yet to happen, despite the fact that Thiem won the US Open last year. Djokovic was defaulted, Nadal was not playing, so all those factors have to be considered. Now, as for Djokovic himself, he recovered from an injury and he brought his A game during the final. And in the final, if you watch the final, it is almost as impressive as Djokovic's finals victory against Nadal from 2 years ago. Last year, Djokovic beat Thiem in the final, despite being, I believe he was 2-1 down last year against Thiem, and then he returned to win. But his aura is so daunting for players that even during that Thiem match from last year, the final, it never seemed that Djokovic was out of control or that he was going to lose. In a final of a Grand Slam, being 2-1 down, you start questioning things, even when Nadal is down at the French Open. For me, I think it's a given, and right after that, the guarantee is Djokovic at the Australian Open. Nadal at the French, Djokovic at the Australian Open. 2-1 down, big deal. Djokovic is still going to win because best of 5 is a completely different ball game, which has been proven time after time. Next Gen has got very few victories over the big 3. That said, I have to acknowledge that Tsitsipas has beaten Federer last year, even though Federer was not healthy, but that does not matter. A win is a win, and this time Tsitsipas beat Nadal after Nadal was up 2-0, resulting in a very ridiculous outcome. It was the second time in the career of Rafael Nadal that in a Grand Slam, after leading for 2 sets, Nadal lost the match. So, great props to Tsitsipas. And then Medvedev made the Grand Slam final. Just like Thiem has made 3 or 4 Grand Slam finals, Medvedev now has 2. So we're seeing hints and we're seeing small steps being taken by the next generation, even though the next generation is not all that young. I think Thiem is 27, Medvedev is 25, Zverev is going to be 23, or he already is, I'm not entirely sure. Then you have the lesser of the big 3 of the next gen, being Shapovalov and Auger-Aliassime, all these players. It remains to be seen. But the biggest statement made by the king of Australian Open, Novak Djokovic, was in the press conference, I believe, one of the press conferences after the matches, or during one of the interviews with Mats and Mats Wilander, that we are not going to hand it over. Or rather, Djokovic himself said that I am not going to hand it over to the next gen. They have to wrestle it away from me. And I'm not old. So that is something that is so powerful. At least in my mind, I always take that statement as something very impactful. That it shows the attitude, the determination, and the lack of willingness to give up. Just because people say that, oh yeah, you're getting older, so it's about time that the next gen takes over, or rather, the media trying to persuade you with all these reports that, oh, the next gen is taking over, Medvedev is going to win. That is a natural progression of things, which is going to happen eventually. But the urgency from the media, or the premature announcements that, oh, the next gen is here because Thiem won the U.S. Open, is this a changing of the guard? And that's the job of the journalists, but it does not mean that the people, or rather the players involved, they have to just bow down and accept that as fact. That is not going to happen. And Djokovic did exactly that. He saw a very competitive match, well, for some points during between Medvedev and Tsitsipas in the semifinals, and for the finals, he was prepared. He was vintage Djokovic. It was very engaging for the first, I would like to say, the first 12 games of that match are very closely fought. The match which Djokovic won today. And it's reflective of Medvedev's fighting spirit too, that Djokovic, after being a break up and 3-0 up, Medvedev managed to level the match at 3-3 in the first set. So Djokovic's impact on the entire greatest of all time race is very much in stride and very strong still, because he still is not favored to lose any match that he's supposed to otherwise have won. Medvedev had a 20-match winning streak, and people bought into that, and this should. Medvedev's level of play was very high, and he was cleaning the court with Tsitsipas. He was making Tsitsipas run miles every time there was a massive rally. Tsitsipas was not coming out on top. There was frustration on his end during the semifinal. So Medvedev is climbing higher amongst the next generation itself. Thiem has a tendency to gas out sometimes. Medvedev is not in that category yet. His health is up there. Maybe he needs to introduce a bit of variety into his game, because that's what Djokovic did a lot of. Djokovic mixed up his game, which he mentioned himself. You have to mold your game. You have to change your tactics according to a particular opponent. So when it came to Medvedev, Djokovic knew that Medvedev and Djokovic's styles are rather similar. They're both counterpunchers or baseliners who like to grind it out from the back of the baseline. Djokovic introduced a lot of volleying into his game today, and he was cutting the corners. He was serving and volleying too. He had an amazing serve and volley in which he approached, and it was coming to his backhand and low, and he managed to scrape that ball just over the net on the other side, cross court. It was beautiful. It was like he was supposed to be a specialist volleyer. He's not, but he has the ability to play those shots, and that is what counts. If you can change your tactics, regardless of crowd support, regardless of the situation of the match, regardless of the stage that you're at, regardless of the history at stake. For Djokovic, there's always some history at stake. After this win, Djokovic guarantees he's going to break Federer's weeks at number one record. Federer is at 310, and by March, Djokovic will cross that mark, something that the journalists did not bring up enough or at all. I think Djokovic mentioned it during the press conference. So that said, Djokovic is now at 18 Grand Slam titles and 9 Australian Opens. The question arises, what is the likelihood of him to win Wimbledon, even the French Open maybe, and then the US Open? What are his chances? You would on the surface you'd say it's very high. Last year he was undefeated until his disqualification of the US Open, something that was very, very unfortunate for him, unintentionally hitting a lineswoman and then getting disqualified. It was what it was. But I believe it would take a lot of fortitude and self-belief to get yourself out of that hole, because Djokovic had a decent French Open, even though he was not himself for the last 2 matches, I believe. And Nadal was spectacular during the French Open, don't get me wrong. And then from that point to string together the confidence, it's something you would expect from Djokovic, but it still does not mean that just because someone is in the habit of doing great things does not take away the credit that they did those things. So Djokovic is still a champion out and out. He is the man to beat. Regardless of who he faces, at the big stages, at the Grand Slams, he's the man to beat. On clay, it's Nadal. On every other surface, it's Djokovic. Now, we also have to see what impact Federer will have, because he's returning at Doha, I believe, or Dubai. So we will see how much or how little of an impact he makes, how much things are different as a result of his return. But Djokovic is the man to beat. Djokovic is playing very good tennis. How much his injury will affect his plans moving forward is also something that he referred to. He has not made any commitments to any other tournaments, and he will just bask in the glory of his current victory and then plan ahead. Something that is going to be important to keep a track of is the fact that Djokovic, now that he's crossed the threshold of weeks at number one and he's broken Federer's record, he would not make staying world number one a priority. So he would pick and choose, just like Federer was for the majority of his run after 2017. So we'll see how much that affects the tour itself. Maybe we'll miss the top 3 from a lot of these ATP 500 tournaments. Maybe that'll become a habit. Nadal is going to be very relevant, especially when the French Open rolls around. You know, the next Grand Slam at the French Open is going to be all about Federer trying to stop Nadal from Grand Slam number 21, or Federer trying to win Grand Slam number 21 himself. It's very unlikely to happen, but you never know. These things always turn out to be very interesting. There might be some other narrative that is woven into it. Maybe Nick Kyrgios breaks out, or some other member of the next gen breaks out. Maybe Karatsev would be a man to keep a track of, but unlikely still. You have these firecrackers with a very short life but a very bright flame. We'll see if some of these also are apparent in the months to come. As for Djokovic, history is at stake. There is no reason to believe he will not win Wimbledon or he will not win US Open. There's everything to take. Everything is up for grabs, and injury is the only enemy that might play a factor, and quarantine results and quarantine factors might also change some of his plans. But here's hoping to a very competitive tennis season ahead. Nadal, Federer's returning, Djokovic is firing on all cylinders, injury notwithstanding. So let's see. And the constant noise of the next generation. They're buzzing, they're getting better, they're appearing in Grand Slam finals, they're winning ATP World Tour finals. Will that have any impact at the Grand Slam level this year? My prediction is not yet. Team, maybe, if his gas tank is enough, if his cardio and stamina holds out, maybe he might appear at the French Open finals. Wimbledon would be the most interesting Grand Slam because is Federer still good enough to win? Still, at 39 years old. Last time he competed at Wimbledon, he squandered a championship point. How much of his ghosts are still haunting him remains to be seen. Wimbledon would be the most unpredictable one for me. And French Open, will Nadal get 21? Or rather, the question is, who is going to stop Nadal from winning 21? So here's to a great season ahead, and thank you for watching if you made it all the way through. I shall try to come up with more videos in the future. Cheers.